Now what we're going to do is look at exponential graphing. There's a few different steps that we're going to start with. First is we're going to decide, is it a growth model or a decay model? Growth model is when our b value, and the b value is the number underneath the exponent, is greater than 1. And a decay model is when our b value is in between 0 and 1. So we're not going to get a b value that's negative. It's always going to be positive. So we just have to decide, is it over 1, then it's growth. If it's not over 1, then it's going to be decay. Next thing that we're going to do is find the horizontal asymptote. How we're going to write it is y is equal to whatever our k value is. Our constant value always tells us what our y-intercept is. We're going to write our table of values, and the numbers that we're going to use are -1, 0, and 1. Then what we're going to do is we're going to plot it in graph. So looking at our first one, what we have is deciding if it's growth or decay. We see that our b value is 2, so this would be a growth model. Then our horizontal asymptote is going to be y is equal to -1 because it's our k value. Then the next thing that we're going to do is our table of values. This is the hardest part. When we plug in a -1, what it does is flips the number, so it becomes 1/2 minus 1, which is -1/2. Then whenever we plug in a 0, it gives us a 1, so 1 minus 1 is 0. Then when we plug in a 1, it stays the same, so that would be 2 minus 1, which is 1. So now what we're going to do is we're going to graph this. We have our horizontal asymptote at -1. Then with our line, we have -1, -1/2, 0, 0, and 1, 1. And this right here would be our graph. Now for the second one, first thing that we want to do is decide if it's growth or decay. We see that the b value is 1/2, so that means that it's decay. Then we have our horizontal asymptote. Our horizontal asymptote is always y equals whatever our constant value is. So in this case, it's -2. Then we're going to come up with our table of values. So we have -1, 0, and 1. And when we're plugging those in, if we plug in a -1, what it does is it flips it. So it gives us 2 minus 2, which of course is 0. Then when we plug in a 0, anything to the 0 is 1. So it's 1 minus 2, which is -1. And then when we plug in a 1, what it does is it stays the same. So it's 1/2 minus 2, which is -1.5. We have the horizontal asymptote at -2. And then when we graph it, we have -1, 0, 0, -1, and 1 and 1.5. And that right there would be our graph. So looking at letter C, we're looking at our B value and we're deciding, is this growth or decay? And we see that it would be decay. Our horizontal asymptote is always our constant value. So that would be y is equal to 1. Next thing that we're going to do is we're going to come up with our table of values. And when we come up with our table of values, we have the -1, 0, and 1. -1 means we flip it. So we have 3/2 plus 1, which is 2.5. Anything to the 0 power is 1. 1 plus 1 is 2. And when we plug in a 1, it stays the same. So that would be 2/3 plus 1, which is 1 and 2/3. We have our horizontal asymptote at 1. So we're plotting a point at 1, or I should say a horizontal line at 1. And then when we graph it, we have -1, 2.5. We have 0, 2, and we have 1, 1, and 2/3. So this right here is a decay model. So looking at letter D, we have to decide growth or decay. The 3 tells us that it's a growth model. Our horizontal asymptote, y is equal to -4. Then what we're going to do is we have our table of values, and we're going to use the -1, 0, and 1. If we plug in a -1, it flips it, so it's 1/3 minus 4, which is -3 and 2/3. If we plug in a 0, anything to the 0 is 1. 1 minus 4 is -3. And then if we plug in a 1, it stays the same. So that would be 3 minus 4, which is -1. So we have our horizontal asymptote at -4. And then we have -1, -3 and 2/3, 0, -3, and 1, -1. So looking at the next one, we have to decide if it's growth or decay. This right here tells us that it's a decay model. And then our horizontal asymptote would be y is equal to 0, because adding and subtracting a 0, we don't see a number. And then what we're going to do is we're going to come up with our -1, 0, and 1 values. So if we plug in a -1, it flips, and that would be 3. Plug in a 0, anything to the 0 is 1. If we plug in a 1, it stays the same, so that would just be 1/3. We see our horizontal asymptote would be at 0. And then when we graph this, we have -1, 3, 0, 1, and 1 and 1/3. And for our last one, once again, we have to decide if it's growth or decay. We see that 3/2 is more than 1, so this right here would be growth. Our horizontal asymptote would be y is equal to 2. It's always our constant value. If we plug in a -1, 0, 1, -1 flips it, so we have 2/3 plus 2, which is 2 and 2/3. Anything to the 0 power is 1. 1 plus 2 is 3. And when we plug in a 1, it stays the same. So that would be 3/2 plus 2, which would be 3.5. Our horizontal asymptote is 2. So -1, 2 and 2/3, 0, 3, and 1 and 3.5.